Welcome everybody who's joining. We've got a lot of people joining us today, so we're just going to take a couple of minutes just to let everybody filter through. So thanks for your patience. Welcome everybody joining and to our speakers. We have more people filtering through, but because it is a brief session that we have, I'm going to start with our introductions. Welcome to the February Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network webinar. If you are new to VAMHN, we are a research and knowledge exchange network. One of the things that we do is this monthly webinar program where we are aiming to bring you the latest research and analysis from across the sector, really to share with you what's going on and the latest in knowledge and practice. We are delighted at the response that we've been having to these webinars, to the feedback that we've been getting. The sign-ups are increasing every month, so thank you, and please do continue to share information about the webinar program and also about the network itself with your colleagues. It's free to join, and you get access to lots of different resources through our website and our monthly newsletter. How today will be running, we have a 20-minute presentation and then a 20-minute question and answer. If you can use the chat box, please, to do introductions, to share links and resources. That's a really nice way of sharing the expertise that is in the room. Please use the Q&A box. That's a separate box for questions. I'll be moderating that at the end of the presentation, trying to get through as many questions as I can, grouping those thematically. If we're getting more, then I think we can manage to get through. Just to reassure you that we are sharing the recording, we are sharing the slides and some other resources as well that our speakers have shared for us. They will be posted online and also emailed out to everybody who signed up to attend, so you will be getting all of those resources. So I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming and introducing our speakers for this month. We have Ravi, Thiara, who is Professor of Sociology at Warwick University, and Sumanta, who is Head of Research and Development at Imkaan. Their full bios will be appearing in the chat very shortly if they're not already there. And they're going to be doing a joint presentation on their recent research, which culminated in a project report titled "Why Should Our Rage Be Tidy?", which was recently launched in Parliament. It is so important, and I'm so delighted to be having them here today to speak to us. So if we can have the slides loaded up, please, and I will hand over to you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sian. Just wait for the slides to load up. We're really delighted to be able to present our recent findings. So thank you to VAMHN for inviting us. We're going to try and share very quickly, sort of race through some of the key findings. And if any of you are interested, obviously you'll get the link to the full report, but if you're interested in continuing the conversation, then you can contact Sumanta and I by our email. So just to say, we looked at the experiences of minoritized survivors in a context, their experiences of mental health in a context of violence and abuse. And we know that, the links between these two aspects are well established. There's an extensive research evidence now, including the important work that VAMHN colleagues have done in this area, which highlights this linkage, as well as kind of the ripples, to use Bufaki and Gilson's phrase, across all significant aspects of survivors' lives. So their work on sexual violence, they argue that sexual violence, for instance, is not an event, but an experience with enduring and radiating consequences, especially when there's an absence of a listening and supportive community and positive responses. So I think the impact of violence and abuse on psychological well-being can also be regarded in this way. It's the ripples that continue to exist for years and years after in survivors' lives. And we know that the evidence for minoritized survivors is limited, though some research has highlighted the differentiated experiences, but this research base has focused mainly on South Asian women, and it's quite dated. It reveals, for instance, high levels of depression, anxiety, suicide, and suicide attempts among young Asian women, for instance. Another research has been done in the health inequalities arena, which has revealed the punitive and medicalized responses to racialized minorities, especially Black Caribbean groups. But in all of this, little has really been done specifically on the linkage between mental health well-being in a context of violence and abuse. Next slide, please, Flavia. So just a quick word about the study. It was funded by VAMHN, and it was a collaboration between myself at Warwick, Imkaan, and the Women and Girls Network. It's largely qualitative. So we have in-depth interviews with survivors, key experts, and focus groups with practitioners, as well as a survey with Imkaan members and Women and Girls Network. It was advised by a group of lived experience experts who prefer to be seen as survivor activists, and we can talk more about this later. The interviews with survivors included a highly diverse group of women, aged between 22 and 52 years. You can see the diversity there in the slide. Significantly, almost a third had insecure immigration, and they'd been supported for between 2 months and 4.5 years by the organisation through which we approach them. And of course, these voices of the survivors sit at the heart of our research and ensure that the findings are rooted in their realities. And having the survivor activists advisory group was really, of immeasurable value. They engaged in a listening project, generating valuable ideas, not only about what's malfunctioning in our support system for minoritized survivors, but also what's required for change. So why should our age be tidy is amongst the first to document in detail the specific experiences of minoritized survivors, and it engages us, invites us to engage with and reflect on the issues and challenges that women have had to navigate, even whilst their mental well-being is eroded and misunderstood. I think it comes as no surprise to those of us who are part of this webinar to know that the dominant response to survivors has been to psychopathologize their distress and trauma. And that's also something that's increasingly coming under criticism as part of a wider critique of the medicalization of everyday life. And for us, it's crucial to locate such mental health impacts of abuse within gendered and racialized social relations, rather than seeing them as a deficit within individuals. Next slide, please. So clearly, intersectional location and situational context create nuance and complexity for survivors. They shape women's experiences of abuse and the psychological distress that's linked to that, the effects of that and the responses that they received. And it's evident that these contexts in which violence and abuse was experienced and the obstacles for women to secure positive interventions all impacted on their mental health and well-being. And intersecting, so what we found was intersecting abuse incorporated every facet of their lives, and it was aimed at completely eroding their sense of self. It points to high levels of coercive control that was perpetrated often by multiple people through surveillance, coercion, and intimidation across the life course, and of course, with obvious implications. So, there was greater levels and intensity of abuse over a longer period, greater levels of extreme coerced social isolation and emotional neglect, weaponization of insecure immigration status, and significantly high levels of daily, very often sexual violence, and high levels of economic abuse. And of course, then the pressure of multiple silencing factors, which were all aimed at securing their compliance. Um, and the abuse that they experienced in their personal lives and its silencing was reinforced by structural violence through kind of discriminatory service responses and also a hostile immigration and asylum system, which all served to add to women's eroded well-being. Next slide, please. I'm going to leave you to read the quotes because we don't have much time. But as you can see, women recounted mental health challenges, which some had previously never experienced, didn't often recognize, and which also manifested in physical symptoms. And they talked about the corrosive impact of abuse as a slow, insidious process. They talked about an overriding sense of betrayal and loss. Now, we know that loss of liberty, identity, and autonomy are at the heart of coercive control, and the multiple ways in which their identity and autonomy was undermined were highlighted. So, significantly, they talked about a loss of self, loss of family, community, and social support, and a loss of stability and security within a wider sense of betrayal, which left women with a deep feeling of erosion of self. So women spoke about losing themselves and overwhelming feelings of hopelessness. In fact, women felt crushed. And when this happens, they question their very being and regard themselves as having failed in meeting the gendered expectations others had of them. Many described this as becoming, and I quote, quiet inside, though this quietness was also underpinned by a deep anger. Next slide, please. So, there were similar factors that silenced women, both about their mental health, but also about the abuse that they endured. And, we know that violence, we refer to as the violence of silence. Fear of stigma and shame within their communities was a huge pressure to cover up their issues, and this erasure further complicates women's attempts to navigate a path to recovery. However, knowing the ways in which any sign of mental ill health could be weaponized by men and families, and indeed the system, particularly the family courts, women also resisted stigma and shame by coping on their own and what they described as holding it in. And for some, this led to a somatization and a presentation of their physical symptoms. And of course, holding it in, as they said, didn't remove the deep sense of shame. That's shame at a personal level, at a family level, and also at a community level, and the self-blame which featured large in women's narratives. So, for instance, for Caribbean women, this was often because of what's referred to as race loyalty. That's the imperative to not reinforce racialized assumptions about broken families, as well as the pressure to be strong, what's been referred by others as the strong Black woman trope. And for Asian and Middle Eastern women, stigma of mental health in their communities was a big factor. And of course, all of this meant that not only did women have to cope with the impacts of abuse, but they also had to navigate and manage gendered expectations about protecting men, families, and communities from external scrutiny with, negative consequences for their own well-being. Links with past histories of oppression and intergenerational trauma were acknowledged in the pressure to be strong and to mask weakness, and something that clearly denied survivors help and support. So they spoke about not being heard, about being seen as crazy, not being believed, and being blamed. And this isn't to say that they didn't resist violence and abuse and the negative labeling and silencing of their psychological distress. Women's agency is clearly evident in their actions to effect change in their situations, even if it took them a long time. And many of them had started to reframe all of these silencing pressures through their recovery journeys. Next slide, please. So women spoke about the various ways in which the system reinscribes trauma, and the wider context of the treatment, unequal treatment and outcome for minoritized communities, I think creates a wider context in which minoritized survivors experience their interactions with the health support system. And for the women we interviewed, the trauma of abuse was compounded by the trauma of racism, both historic and current. And in the face of the violence of dehumanization they experience, women repeatedly ask the question, why can't we be seen as human beings in a context where they felt treated as less than human? Racialized assumptions, which were different for different groups of women, underpinned professional responses, being regarded as angry Black woman and an undeserving victim because of women presenting as strong and as coping. Adultification were repeatedly raised for Caribbean women. Others were regarded as having no agency and uniformly victimized by overly oppressive men, families, and cultures. And of course, all of these responses failed to recognize women's mental health challenges. Next slide, please. In general, professionals were experienced as having little professional curiosity when dealing with them. And there was a sense of being treated and made to feel, as I said, as less than human. And the absence of people wanting to help was a source of frustration and at times pain for women. Next slide, please. So worryingly, women's interactions with health professionals were dominated by an overwhelmingly medicalized response and show a lack of understanding and engagement with their histories of abuse. And this, this isn't new really. Other research has also shown this. And the failures of professionals to link women's experiences of abuse and their diverse presentations of trauma were repeatedly highlighted. They'd rarely been asked about any underlying reasons. Instead, they spoke about the medicalization of their issues, where GPs routinely prescribed medication without much explanation of what it would do. So effectively, women were being medicated to deal with men's violence. Instead, what women said was, I don't need medication, I just needed to talk to somebody. Next slide, please. So pathologization of survivors' trauma was commonplace, something that was of concern for some of the women that we spoke to. And of course, in a context of racialization, the potential for misdiagnosis is obvious. If racialization reinforces the rendering of abused women as mad, either because they don't fit the normative view of the deserving victim, are deemed to be aggressive and angry and full of unpredictable rage, or too weak to speak for themselves, then a question that arises is what barriers to justice are created for some of the most marginalized survivors? How do you hold your abuser to account and get justice or challenge a discriminatory system if you're deemed to have a personality disorder and thus be an unreliable narrator of your own abuse and trauma experiences? How do you find healing in that context? I'll just pass you on now. I'll finish there, pass you on to Sumanta.
Thank you, Ravi. Next slide, please, Flavia. I'm going to share some of the insights from the professionals and organisations we spoke to. So you've heard from Ravi that violence and abuse from someone close often left women with an overwhelming sense of betrayal, loss, breach of trust, emotional wounds and harm. So healing from this relational injury requires us to focus our work with survivors on what we frame as relational repair. As well as sharing the challenges women encountered, they spoke about the positive and important elements of their healing journeys. So what does that look like? Next slide, please. Women survivors that we spoke to emphasised the importance of slow work, being seen as a whole person, and for practitioners to have a wraparound sense of understanding to counteract the dehumanising impact of their contact, mainly with mainstream statutory agencies and professionals. Women emphasised the cruciality of specialist trauma-informed support provided by and for services, and their pivotal role in undoing the added distress and harm caused by the system, which left women feeling powerless, where they were labelled as mad or angry, and which often led to their disengagement from mainstream support. These organisations, they were described as spaces for understanding, warmth, human connection, where they could talk to someone from a similar background without having to repeat themselves, teach or educate. Significantly, this is where women's trauma responses to violence and abuse were normalised, and where they were helped to regain their strength and confidence to heal. When survivors are validated and supported to make sense of what's happening to them physically, emotionally, and spiritually as a consequence of abuse, it was very powerful in that it unsilenced the silencing. They spoke about continuity and support, reaching a point of stability and safety before healing could begin. Longer-term support was also essential to help women to make decisions that felt really impossible earlier on in their journey, whether that was about supporting a prosecution, whether that was engaging with any kind of support, or, you know, feeling ready after they were able to receive the immigration support, for example, immigration-based support they needed, for example. And it's not just talking that women wanted. They spoke about the value of bespoke interventions, which, as a survivor told us, looked at what women actually need and what's going to cause the least distress, as not everybody wants to sit down and chat. This could involve EDMR therapy, body therapies, emotional support to engage with activities with peers. And something that was very essential was having a trusted advocate that could walk with them during their help-seeking journey and hold agencies to account to challenge systematic racism and discrimination. Women also had to feel a sense of readiness for formal counselling. So many women required a less structured approach and needed something that was much more flexible, informal emotional support at the point they needed it, rather than formal weekly sessions. Building relationships with a supportive community of survivors offered validation. It reduced social isolation, and also using their experiences to engage in what we frame as survivor activism to create wider system change was really key to shifting both power and healing. It was evident that with the right support, women were helped to reframe the negative view of themselves, the feelings of self-blame and shame that had been imposed by others, and gained greater personal insights. Next slide, please. Minoritized women were often in contact with specialist and for services much later than they should have been, in the absence of timely specialist support across the mental health and health system. These organisations were often seeing women who'd either never accessed any formal support before, when women were on the other end of the help-seeking process, often at the point when women's symptoms had become much more complex and entrenched. Specialist organisations were often intervening when women were in crisis after they'd been in and out of the health system, as you can see from those quotes, sometimes for many years, which created this revolving door. For women, this increased anxiety, feelings of insecurity and helplessness rather than alleviate it. Integrated VAWG trauma-informed pathways and early access to appropriate support is essential if we are to prevent mental health issues becoming more serious and chronic. And yet we were told that there's often this expectation from the statutory mainstream sector that this complexity should be picked up solely by specialist for organisations without due consideration of statutory accountability, resources and capacity. Yet without these organisations, women told us they would literally have nowhere to go. Practitioners also shared the many organisational constraints within which they were operating. Specialist organisations offer a really important alternative to the generic short-term CBT interventions that women sometimes had to wait, perhaps for a year or even 2 years to access through the NHS. However, these specialists were often forced to limit and narrow the scope of their clinical trauma work because of a lack of and short-term funding approaches, placing organisations under pressure to respond to complex layered trauma, sometimes within 10 to 12 sessions of counselling. The relational support which women value requires diverse leadership and support structures, yet only 4% of therapists come from Black and minoritized communities. This lack of diversity often alienated women that needed mental health support. How do we also address the systematic barriers to entry and retention in the mental health workforce? Next slide, please. A key question. The report also contains a call to action and a charter with 7 clear and uncompromising demands for dignity and changes in policy and practice, developed by a group of survivor activists who form part of a lived experience advisory group during the research. So the survivor activists' calls for change included being treated with dignity and respect by all the services, for systems to work in ways that see and respond to the racialized and gendered harms and ripples of trauma, understand that vulnerabilities and agency can coexist, but not through racialized and gendered assumptions and stereotypes, to engage with the reality that healing isn't a linear process, to see systems reformed to protect rather than re-traumatize, and to ensure funding and resources reach organisations that truly understand their needs, such as those within the buy and force specialist sector. Next slide, please. A key question that emerged for us during the research is, can we really claim to be trauma-informed unless we address structural inequalities across our systems of support? So there was a really strong call for honest, reflective and conscious practice and commitment from senior leaders to identify and address the everyday structural barriers across the mental health and other statutory systems of support, ensure that professionals across the sectors are trained to understand the links between violence and abuse and trauma through an intersectional lens, but also for there to be greater attention towards identifying the internal risks of violence and abuse that might have far-reaching consequences for women, including depression, self-harm, suicide, which have been neglected because of the continued emphasis on the physical risks of violence and abuse. You know, sadly, this issue has come to the forefront in an inquest that's happening at the moment into the suicide of Michelle Sparman, a Caribbean woman in 2021, whose family have raised concerns about the coercive controlling behaviour by her ex-partner prior to her death. The inquest will now look at domestic abuse and whether agencies had failed in their duty to protect her. There was also a strong sense that bespoke, holistic forms of recovery work delivered in the sector are undervalued by mainstream agencies, so funders and policy leads were encouraged to be more innovative, to invest in non-Eurocentric forms of preventative recovery, longer-term holistic support, delivered in the buy and for sector as a contrast to the medical and pathologizing response they received. There was also a call to listen to lessons from other parts of the world where psychoeducational work is integrated across policing, social care and health systems. So just to give you an example, where psychotherapists are allocated to take statements from survivors in place of the police, or where statements are only taken from rape survivors after 48 hours and 2 sleep cycles in recognition of the way that trauma impacts memory. We've got detailed recommendations in the report. I'm not going to go through those now, but we'll be working with the co-authors Imkaan to push for changes through national targeted strategic advocacy and a national online seminar, and ensuring that mental health and health is foregrounded as part of our ongoing work to influence the government's forthcoming violence against women and girls strategy. We do want the government to prioritise a national working group with key partners so we can better understand care pathways, barriers to access, mental health inequalities. We're asking for an appointment of a mental health commissioner to advocate for the needs of minoritised women. We need services and commissioners to engage in the holistic intersectional practices developed by specialist Black and minoritised led by and for VAWG organisations. We need the local integrated care boards to collaborate with specialists so that we have mental health strategies that have a stronger and specific focus on race, gender and violence against women and girls. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking at one of the key recommendations is also around training and education resources to ensure everyone has a better understanding around the links between violence and abuse and VAWG-related trauma and intersectionality. And importantly, we need to start treating access to mental health support as a form of social justice. Thank you for listening. Our details are there, as Ravi said, if you want to download the full report or the Survivors Charter, and our emails.
Ravi, Sumanta, thank you so much for sharing, for doing the work, firstly, and for sharing with us today. I know it's a big and rich report with a lot of recommendations, and asking you to do it justice in 25 minutes was a huge ask. So I know that people will want to read the report as well. So thank you for that link. We will be sending that through with everybody, to everybody who signed up, along with the slides and also with the recording. We do have some time for questions. So if you would like to start typing those through into the Q&A box, I will be able to ask those to our speakers. I think there's so much there to talk about, and I was really struck by what we think about how so much of the attention to violence is on the external sides, and really that need to look at the inside about what's happening internally for women, and a lot of metaphors actually, and talk quotes around the inside, about feeling quiet inside and holding it in, but then also about being in the system rather than with services. And I think that feeling consumed almost by a system that isn't really doing what you need it to do is such a powerful way of thinking about things. And also your point, Ravi, about the women being medicated to deal with men's violence, I think is such a powerful statement, and one that really resonated for me as I was listening to you talking. Clear that there is such an inadequacy in the services, and that this research is being done at a time of such crisis for the sector generally, and for buy and for services specifically, at a time when they really are so needed. Can I ask a question from Natalie Collins, which is, what are your thoughts on the value of the power, threat, meaning framework in working with Black and racially minoritized women?
Yeah, thank you, Sian and Natalie, for asking that question. I mean, I think the thing that I would say is we're doing a piece of work now, and Akima Thomas from Women and Girls Network has a lot of insight and experience in working in different holistic, intersectional and empowering ways. So it's a shame that she couldn't be here, because she would have been the one to respond to this question. But I think I think it, from what I know about this framework, I think it has a lot of potential. And without sort of knowing and having done any research on this as to who's using it, I'm sure there are practitioners who are using this in ways, that is helpful for minoritized survivors. I think certainly it kind of moves away from the more medical, approach to working with survivors. And I think if it's informed by experiences of violence and abuse, and it factors that into the way that it works, I think it has a lot of potential. So I can't say more than that, and I think Akima would have more to say on it. But I think certainly in the piece of work that we're going to be doing, which is coming out of this, to look at what kind of approaches and models are helpful, that's certainly one of the things that we'll be looking at. So thank you for your question.
I have a question from Julie Evans, which is, how can all of the wonderful organisations represented here, and there are a huge number of wonderful organisations represented here today, and it's been wonderful seeing those introductions and those names on the list. How can these organisations start to work together to improve support for women and girls, given we work across sections and are limited by procedures and capacity?
I'll let you answer that, Sumanta.
It's a very big question. I'm not sure there's any one answer for it, but I think it's about connections and collaborations between different organizations in local areas who are, one of the things that is really evident is that there are a lot of silos in the sector, and women are being passed from service to service to service. And then there's, referral pathways that could be improved, learning and knowledge that could be shared. So for me, it's about, that creating some connections and networks. We will be, with this work, doing some more work in terms of trying to raise awareness at a local level across different regions and local authorities. So for us, it's a sort of awareness raising piece and a strategic advocacy piece. So I'm not sure that answered your question, but for me, and there are also about 30, we have 38 burn force services across the country who have very specific ways of working, and I always encourage organizations to reach out and create connections between each other.
Thank you. A question about the recommendation really that mental health should be seen as a form of social justice in itself, and a question: can the mental health system really be seen as a social justice for minoritized women when such harm has been perpetrated on them within the system?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think our point wasn't so much about the mental health system being seen as social or, delivering social justice, but that access to support for mental health and well-being should be seen as a form of social justice. So that doesn't necessarily, the support for mental health doesn't necessarily mean through the existing mental health system. And in fact, there's a school of thought amongst Black feminists, isn't there, which is you can't use the master's tools to build something. You have to kind of dismantle and start again. And that's certainly a narrative that exists in this world, and in those practitioners who are working in ways that draw on sort of cultural strengths to kind of avoid the pathologizing ways of working. I think we can't forget that there are pathologizing processes also within communities that are, that exist simultaneously with the more kind of positive ways that one can work with those. But certainly, I think when we talk about access to mental health support, we are talking about support that is more meaningful, that engages women, recognizes the entirety of their lives and experiences in something that makes sense to them, not necessarily kind of, trying to shoehorn their experiences into a framework that doesn't quite meet and respond to their needs.
And I was just going to add, thank you, Ravi, that when we think of justice in the context of the VAWG sector, the lens is often around policing and improving policing, and there's a great investment in that. So for us, it was also about looking at other parts of the system where we need to create the systemic change, and when we need to shine a light on where the inequalities are showing up. So yeah.
Thank you both. A couple of questions about the research process. So I'll ask them both together. How was the advisory group formed? Could you say a bit more about their role and the process for making the charter? And also, how did you safely facilitate the work of the survivor activists?
Do you want to start, Sumanta, or do you want me to start?
I could start with the recruitment maybe, and then you could do the step before. So as Ravi said, this research was a collaboration with Ravi at the University of Warwick and Women and Girls Network, which some of you may be familiar with, a frontline organisation that works pan-London, and does a lot of, has a very intersectional model around working around women's mental health and well-being and VAMHN. They also have survivor panels that they set up internally. And so some of the survivors were recruited through that organisation, and Imkaan has 38 members across the UK. So we reached out to our membership to see if there would be women that would be interested in being recruited in a more formal way as well, which was also resourced, so it wasn't voluntary either. And that was a really important part of the process for us in terms of creating something that was quite, reciprocal and not a transactional relationship.
Yeah, and I think just to say, when we included this in the small grant that VAMHN, gave us to be able to do this work, it was limited. And I think we soon realised as the process started. So we'd built in the experts by experience, sort of throughout the research cycle, but at particular kind of key moments. And that soon went out of the window. And thankfully, Imkaan was able to provide greater resources because we had more meetings. The members wanted to be more involved. And we made sure, I think, just to kind of address the other question about safely engaging them, we put a lot of thought into sort of providing a space for them to check in with Akima, who's a very experienced therapist. And we did, because the research started sort of during and after COVID, we initially started with online meetings, but then we held in-person meetings, and it soon became transparent that the expert by experience, who we call survivor activists, they want to be called survivor activists, actually wanted to be involved in a more substantial way, and we created that space. And it all took longer. It meant that the research went on for a bit longer, but we were very, I think, committed to making that happen. And then, for them then to produce the charter was part of them, wanting to say more about what needs to be done differently, what needs to change. And the listening project also emerged really from their desire to want to be involved in a more substantial way. So we didn't want them just to kind of have the discussions with us as part of the advisory group. We kind of made it as part of the research process itself, where we kind of facilitated, a bit like, I don't know if anybody listens to Radio 4, they have a listening project where two people have a conversation with each other, and that's how we set it up. So we weren't part of that, though we kind of broadly decided what areas that they should cover in that conversation. So we could say a lot more, but I'll stop there.
I was just going to say, we got a really great feedback from the survivor activists that we involved, saying that there was just something very liberating for them to be involved, not only to be talking about, what was wrong, but also to be working with us to advocate for change. So, seeing that whole process through at every point, including when we launched the report in Parliament last year, so which was really, really very powerful. So, it felt like a different way of doing the engagement, and that there's still continued work that they're doing with us at Imkaan as well, through other spaces and networks that we're connecting them in with, where they're speaking to policymakers and decision makers. So yeah, we sort of worked fluidly and flexibly and creatively, along the way.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our time. I'm not going to be able to get through all of the questions, but I am going to ask you to close with a question from Nanya, which is, what one thing would you want to change or people to know to support victim survivors to get help sooner?
I'm just going to answer very quickly and say I'd like there to be more collaboration on a local level between the mental health sector and those that are working in a trauma-informed way around violence against women and girls in the buy and force sector. So I'd like to see more reaching out and conversation and collaboration on a local level.
Yeah, and I think linked to that, one of the things we found was where women got earlier access or access sooner to a buy and force service, their journeys around recovery seem to be a lot more positive. And I think just first responders, even just making women aware that specialist services exist, I think makes a huge difference to survivors' journeys of recovery.
Thank you. I know we could talk further. I'm going to be respectful of everybody's time and draw us to a close. Thank you both so much for sharing that work with us today and for engaging so thoughtfully with the questions from our audience. Thank you to all of our audience members for taking part, for being with us today, for your questions, for the information you've been sharing in the chat. I'm getting lots of lovely feedback coming through. Thank you all very much. Do look out for the slides, resources and recordings coming through to you shortly. If the link to sign up was forwarded to you and you're not yet a member of the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network, do go to our website and you will get our monthly newsletter, lots of resources, all of the invitations to our webinars, and please do join us in March when we'll be hearing from Emma Yap from University of Bristol, talking about their research on the use of mental health evidence in sexual violence trials. I know that's going to be another really good and important one. Thank you so much and wish you all the best for the rest of your day and your week. Bye.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.